Hello again. Welcome back. My name is Steve Turner. I'm a Sunday school teacher here at First United Methodist in Starkville, and we're continuing our study of the book of Daniel. Today we'll be covering chapters 5 and 6, and just as a recoup of what some of our previous lessons have been about, we're still in the history section of Daniel. So Daniel is separated basically into two sections. The first 6 chapters are basically history and events that happen in history, although there's some prophecy, so to speak. The last 6 chapters are mostly prophecies of Daniel. And Daniel is known as a prophet, so that's kind of one of his main skill sets, or one of his main talents. If you remember back, Daniel and 3 of his colleagues, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have been transported from Judah to Babylon. They've become trusted advisors to Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon. At this point in time, Babylon is at its zenith of power. It's a world power within the Middle East. And as we mentioned, the captives from Judah will be there about 70 years in Babylon. And Babylon that land is going to switch hands. It's eventually going to end up with the Medes and the Persians. So let's go ahead and get started in chapter 5. As with many Sunday school classes, we read the Bible and then we stop and discuss what we've read and read some more of the Bible. I do think it's important to read your Bible, so if you do have a Bible there, we're using the NIV version, New International Version of the Bible, so if you want to read along with me and follow. Most of the time I'll read verbatim. Sometimes if it's repeating certain things, I might skip a little bit around, but I'm reading mostly verbatim. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the God of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched as the hand wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, and they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew even more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, or maybe the queen mother, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have great insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you're able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations of the people of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. And those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne, stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank from them. You praised the gods of silver, of gold, bronze, iron, and wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Okay, we have the famous writing on the wall. And again, Daniel is the interpreter. Daniel is the one they call in because they know that he has the ability to interpret dreams. And this is basically another mystery that they cannot solve, and all the wise men of Babylon cannot solve. So let's think about a little bit about what we've read. First of all, this is the first time we see Belshazzar. He's either the son of Nebuchadnezzar or the grandson. Not real certain there. In the Jewish language, the term for grandfather is really not prevalent. And so they use father or descendant. We know he's related to Nebuchadnezzar. And as you see at the end of these verses, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So now the Medes have taken over Babylon, and the Medes and the Persians are co-rulers. You'll see a new ruler in the next chapter, Darius, and then you're going to see, it's going to mention that Daniel is an administrator in all of these kings' administrations, including Cyrus, the last king that we're going to see in Daniel. So let's talk about what's happened here. Well, when Nebuchadnezzar took over Judah, he brought back not only subjects, people, he also brought things. And he brought things from the temple. And some of the things he brought from the temple were these gold goblets. And so I guess they had been in storage somewhere. And you got to remember that Belshazzar is having a really big party. He's got 1,000 of his nobles that are eating and drinking. That's That's a pretty big party he's got going on. Now, when you read about the history of the downfall of Babylon, this comes into play because the Medes are on the outskirts of Babylon, the city, and the thought is that as they were celebrating and having this feast, the Medes were entering the city and were taking over the city of Babylon. So they were kind of asleep at the wheel here. So they're having this party. Daniel is not there, which is interesting because all his big friends, his nobles, his wives, his concubines, and Daniel's pretty important administrator in Babylon, even under Belshazzar. And so they have this odd occurrence where a hand appears and writes on the wall. It doesn't write much. In fact, it only writes 3 words. Really, it repeats one 2 times, but it writes 3 words, which is a very succinct message. But as you can imagine, the king is very startled, and he wants to find out what the message is, so to speak. Now, Belshazzar is not going to be a ruler for too long, and we know that at the end of this dinner, that's kind of the end of his reign. But again, he asked his wise men, his magicians, his enchanters, his astrologists, what does this mean? None of them can interpret it. Daniel's brought in at the suggestion, we believe, probably of his grandmother or mother, because she would have known very well the ability of Daniel to interpret dreams, to solve problems, and divine mysteries, so to speak. So she says, bring in Daniel. He can probably tell you what's going on. They do that. He says, keep all your gifts. I don't need a gold chain. I don't need a purple robe. I don't need to be third in command. I don't need those things. But I am going to tell you what it means. And he tells them a very sobering message. He says, God has numbered the day of your reign and brought it to an end. Bam. Number 2, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Ooh-wee. Number 3, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So he doesn't hold back at all. He tells them exactly what's going to happen. Now, it's interesting, Belshazzar takes this and he kind of fulfills his commitment. He gives him the robe, purple robe, the gold chain. He proclaims him the 3rd highest ruler in the nation, although I don't know how much that's going to stick, because immediately he gets killed. So it's like, good luck with that. And Darius is going to take over immediately. What's interesting is Darius is going to keep Daniel around. Daniel's got a really powerful reputation. So this is a very famous story. You see it in paintings. You see it in children's Sunday school classes. The writing on the wall. It's very particular and specific to this particular king of Babylon. Let's keep going. Chapter 6. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent. Finally, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown in the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." When the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and make every effort until sundown to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "May the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouth of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he trusted in his God. At the king's command, the men who falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, "May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay, that ends kind of the history section of Daniel. Daniel is near the end of his life. He's in his 80s, possibly even in his 90s. He served in multiple administrations, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar and ending with Cyrus. In this series, though, he's working with Darius the Mede. Okay? So what do we know about Darius and these Medes and these Persians? Well, first of all, we know that the Medes took over Babylonia from Belshazzar, because it was mentioned in the last chapter. It's also apparent that Darius is kind of torn here. he really likes Daniel, and we see that he sets him over the whole kingdom. So it says, now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So what does that mean? Well, he's going to be like the administrator of the whole kingdom. Now, as you can imagine, his other nobles are pretty upset with that. First of all, he's not a Mede. Who is he? Well, he's this Jew from Judah. I might make a correction here. If I said that Daniel was from humble beginnings, that is wrong. We probably believe that Daniel is from the royalty of Judah. We don't have the specifics of that, but we know from what we're told in the first chapter that they took from the best of Judah, Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. So he comes from kind of royalty. He knows royalty. He knows how to operate. And we see that over and over again as his relationship with all of these kings, the 4 kings we have records of him serving under, he's deferent to them. And even here, when he comes out of the lion's den, what is the first thing he says when he comes out of the lion? This is interesting. So Darius threw him in the lion's den. The first thing he says when he comes out of the lion's den is, "May the king live forever." I don't know about you, but that probably would not be the first thing I would say. I might have said thank you for pulling me out of here, but I don't know if I'd say, "May the king live forever." Then he follows that up. "My God sent his angel and he shut the mouths of the lions." All right. So here the focus is on Daniel. Remember, in the furnace, there were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but there was a 4th person. We don't know who it was. Could have been Daniel. Could have been somebody else. But here it's just Daniel. So his colleagues, and I use that term loosely because they weren't his friends, they basically tricked Darius into throwing Daniel into the lion's den, whereby they thought he would be eaten and his competition would be done away with. Well, they were in for a big surprise. Darius was a man such that when Daniel came out of the lion's den, Darius saw the light, so to speak, and it says, "At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den." Did they falsely accuse him? Not really. He did disobey the order. You know, I mean, they tricked him. They tricked Darius into making this edict. But irregardless, they were the ones who got thrown in the lion's den. And at that point, the lions were pretty hungry, I guess, and they overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Okay? So here we see, and then after that, King Darius issues this proclamation that Daniel's God is the living God, he endures forever, and so on. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. You got to remember, there are 70 years of captivity, the Judeans in Babylon and Persia. And so these first 6 chapters of Daniel are that story. And Daniel is the main actor here and the main connection between Judah and Babylon, and then Mede and Persia. And he's quite a character. He's got all the qualities and characteristics that we like to think are good and noble and kind. And he's also very humble. He really didn't, when he said, "We're going to make you 3rd in command," he was like, I don't need that. that's okay. You can do that with someone else. But he was still, he was very competent. He was very humble, and he was a leader within the palace. Okay, we're going to stop there. So we've covered chapters 1 through 6 in Daniel. Again, as a kind of a summarization, the first 6 chapters are really historical. They tell the stories about Daniel and his colleagues, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they give a context to what's going to happen next, because the next 6 chapters are about visions and dreams that Daniel has about the future. And if you are a student of Revelation, a lot of the writings in Revelation seem to be directly lifted from some of the visions and dreams that Daniel has. So again, thank you for sharing this time with us. We'll see you the next time as we continue our study of Daniel. Hope you have a great day.